Religion is everywhere in our world. Whether you're Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, atheist, or just not sure, religion has affected you somehow in your life, for good or bad. Yet no matter your beliefs, it's hard to deny that no single person has influenced the Western world more than Jesus of Nazareth.
Yet, depending on your cultural and religious background, your perception of Jesus, of his life and of his teachings can vary tremendously. Because of that, we find ourselves in a world with many vastly different pictures of Jesus.
How could one man inspire all of this? Either he had the most schizophrenic philosophy ever, or somewhere along the way, our picture of him changed.
The reality is, most of the world's different views of Jesus are based on layer after layer of thousands of years of religious traditions, cultural practices, and philosophical ideas.
So how do we cut through all of that? How do we peel all of these layers back?
Undeniably, the earliest, most comprehensive texts on the life of Jesus of Nazareth are the Gospels.
And whether you believe their claims or not, these 4 texts, more than anything else, provide the clearest, most cohesive picture of this most influential figure.
But in order to understand anything, we need to understand its context. And looking at the Gospels, these are first century documents that describe the life of a first century Jew living in first century Palestine. So if we truly want to understand them, we need to go back 2,000 years, back to where it all happened. And when we do that, we get a dramatically different picture of who Jesus really was.
But how does that affect us here, now, in the 21st century? How could the words of a first century peasant possibly have anything relevant to say about our lives today?
Yet, the startling thing is, according to the Gospels, this first century peasant Jew made a revolutionary claim that he came to change everything.
And what's truly remarkable about him is that unlike any other major religious leader, he didn't place a creed or a philosophy or sacred scriptures as the source of truth. He made himself, his actual personhood, the center of all truth.
So that leaves us with only one question.
Who was this man?
My name is Oleg, and to find out who Jesus really was, I need to go back to where it all happened. That's why I'm in Israel, to walk where Jesus walked, to explore the world he lived in, and to uncover a clearer picture of the original Jesus, the Jesus of the Gospels.
I'm Sergio, and I'm in New York City to see if these ancient words from this ancient man have anything relevant to say about our lives today. What would his teachings look like in a 21st century context? Do they still matter? If there's any place that can answer that, it's here. My favorite city in the world, New York.
The Jesus of the Gospels fills many different roles. But before going into them, one thing that cannot be ignored is that despite many of their grander claims as to who Jesus was, the 4 Gospels all present Jesus as a man. Almost every scholar would agree that the 4 Gospels in the Christian Bible are the 4 earliest written accounts of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. But they're not the only accounts of his life. More and more gospel accounts continued to appear in the centuries following the writing of the first 4 Gospels. And when you examine them, one thing that immediately jumps out is that they present a much less grounded portrait of Jesus. The first 4 Gospels present a man. The later Gospels, in their turn, significantly diminish this aspect of Jesus. For example, the infancy Gospel of Thomas contains fantastical stories about the early life of Jesus. One of them depicts a scene of a 5-year-old Jesus sitting by the ford of a brook, the waters of which he could control with his words. And as he sits there, playfully making sparrows out of clay, some men come, including his father Joseph, to admonish him for breaking the Sabbath. Suddenly, the young Jesus claps his hands, and the clay birds instantly come to life and fly away chirping. So, through these later Gospels, we see that there were those who sought to present a picture of Jesus as purely God, purely a fantastical worker of wonders, someone who lacked any genuine humanity.
And it seems like a lot of us still do that today. I know that in my case, for the longest time, I used to view Jesus not really as a man, but more like God in man's clothing. He was a supernatural being from a far-off place that only pretended at humanity. As a comic book-loving kid, I used to think of him a lot like Superman. You see, Superman is unique among superheroes in that his human alter ego, Clark Kent, is not really who he is. He's actually Kal-El, born on the planet Krypton, sent to Earth by his father. As Clark Kent, he's not really human, he's just pretending to be, to fit in. That's how I used to view Jesus, and I think a lot of us still do. Purely as God, with no genuine humanity.
But the Jesus of the earliest 4 Gospels looks a little different from that. They present a much more grounded, down-to-earth, relatable Jesus. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus didn't begin teaching or preaching until he was 30 years old. In fact, according to the first Gospel ever written, the Gospel of Mark, we see that when Jesus started teaching and preaching, those who knew him well were surprised and caught off guard, because they knew him as a regular guy with a regular family and a regular job. Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us? So, rather than present a picture of a lofty, untouchable religious icon, this earliest gospel shows a regular man with a family. He was someone's son, someone's brother. More than that, the people of his town were surprised to be taught by someone who spent his days performing grueling, back-breaking work. You see, most English Bibles use the word carpenter to describe Jesus' profession. But the Gospels were originally written in Greek, and the Greek word used here that is oftentimes translated as carpenter is tekton. And the word tekton is used to describe manual labor, primarily with stone, metal, and wood. So, before Jesus was anything else, the Gospels describe him as a regular man, a tekton, a construction worker.
New York is one of the greatest cities in the world, but it didn't get this way all by itself. All of the amazing buildings and structures in this city, they were all conceived by brilliant minds born of incredible ingenuity, but they were built by the hands of construction workers. They're who built this city. Even with all of its art and culture and commerce, at its heart, I think of New York as a blue-collar city, built by blue-collar people. And first and foremost, that's who the Jesus of the Gospels was, a blue-collar guy.
This is the city of Sepphoris, and almost certainly Jesus would have worked on building this city. You see, in the beginning of the 1st century, Sepphoris was the capital of Galilee. And right around the time Jesus was born, Romans set fire to the city. Sepphoris was about 3 miles from Nazareth, the village where Jesus grew up. So, for a young man from Nazareth, working his trade as a builder or construction worker, living so close to a city undergoing major reconstruction, this would be the place to go find work. Excavations have revealed a city that is very well preserved, looking much as it would have in the 1st century. And it's safe to assume that some of these very stones would have been placed and hewn and touched by Jesus himself.
In walking through downtown Manhattan, I came across these guys.
Carpenters Union, we're 118.
Their union represents just about any kind of construction or building work you can imagine.
From dock builders, timbermen, scaffold, sheetrock framing, woodwork, computer flooring, ceilings.
They were there in protest for a labor dispute because a company based in that building had labor practices that they felt were damaging to the quality of life for all construction workers in New York.
That wants to exploit their workers and pay them very low, under area standards wages and no benefits, and we're against that.
Basically, they felt that the rich and powerful were exploiting their workers. And in talking to Jerry and Anthony, there was no mistaking the passion for what they do, for what all working-class, blue-collar New Yorkers do.
We work hard for our money. It's a noble cause, noble trade. The laborers, the elevator people, the plumbers, electricians. This is all honorable trades. It's blood, sweat, and tears that goes into building these projects.
In listening to them talk about their craft, one thing was very clear. These guys care about what they do. They're proud of it, and they know how important it is to this city. It's interesting to think that this is the same kind of work that Jesus did. Yet, as vital as their work is, I have a hard time imagining someone like Jerry or Anthony suddenly deciding to quit their job and roam the streets of the city saying things like, "Deny yourselves and follow me," like Jesus did. How would a construction worker go about starting one of the largest movements in the history of the world?
So, in this earliest written gospel, we see a Jesus that is rejected in his hometown, because up until this point in his life, he had seemingly done nothing to make those who grew up with him think that he was anything other than a regular guy, a builder.
Yet what this regular builder aspired to do is unbelievable, to rebuild the whole world.
When I think of a sacred text, I tend to think of a collection of moral or philosophical teachings, fundamental principles, or some sort of code of ethics. The Gospels, on the other hand, present something totally different. Yes, the Gospels contain teachings and principles for living, but they're all provided within the framework of a narrative. They're a story about one man. For the Gospel writers, everything hinges on their hero.
The first gospel ever written, the Gospel of Mark, begins with the words, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus." The whole thing is about him. He is the hero of this story. Then the Gospels go on to describe a man who does incredible, seemingly impossible things. Yet what's fascinating is they present this person who performs miraculous acts as a very grounded, relatable human being.
I think that's a core concept behind the Gospels. Rather than simply listing Jesus' teachings, each gospel writer felt it important to instead make him their central, heroic figure. Jesus is not a dry dispenser of maxims and codes of conduct. He's someone we're meant to connect with, a dynamic hero with a story. When I was a kid, the word hero brought one thing to mind: comics. I absolutely loved comics. Every week, I'd head to the comic book store to read about what my favorite superheroes were up to next. So even though it's been a while, I can think of no better place to explore what a hero's all about than a comic book store. This is New York's biggest comic book store, Midtown Comics. Actually, one of the largest in the United States. While I was there, I had a chance to speak with this guy, Andrew Cohen, their marketing and events coordinator. Andrew told me about what a staple Midtown Comics is for comic book lovers in the city.
Since then, we've grown to be one of the biggest comic book retailers in the country. We get thousands of people in here every week, pick up their comics, pick up their new favorites, follow their favorite characters. So
we went over the state of the comic books industry, how something that started off with a few loyal readers exploded into a huge part of popular culture.
Since then, it's grown exponentially. Anyone can come in here and pick up a comic book. You can see kids of any age. You can see, grown adults. You can see businessmen. You can see a whole wide range of people who come in here and pick up their favorite comics. So it's definitely a much more eclectic group of people now that come in to buy their books.
And as that clientele has gotten more eclectic, so have the range of available comics. Midtown Comics has an enormous selection, and an impressive variety of genres and subject matter, including some you might not expect to see.
But there's new indie comics coming out, cover a whole wide range of spectrums.
But when you get down to it, most comics share a certain similar quality.
The comic book industry is always going to be focused on, like we like to say, men in tights, which are basically superheroes.
And when you look at these superheroes, everything from their extravagant costumes to their spectacular powers, they could not seem more different from us. And that probably has something to do with their initial appeal, but what's unique about comics as a medium is they're able to tell stories over a very large period of time. In some cases, literally decades, through the perspectives of many different writers. And that's something Andrew highlights as vital to why passionate readers keep coming back to their favorite comic books. These fantastical, spectacular superheroes are able to develop a richness and depth of character that would not be possible without the many different perspectives that comics allow for.
Thor is now a woman. Things are always going to change, and it's always going to be a different perspective on a character, and that's what people like, is to see these different perspectives on their favorite characters.
If you can look at a hero from more than one angle, that's when they really come alive.
And that's what's so significant about the Gospel's depiction of Jesus. You're not just getting the perspective of one person, but several. And this multi-layered perspective of the Gospels helps to compose a rich picture of their hero and his personality that we would not have had there only been one Gospel. These different accounts come together to form a dynamic, complex hero with a depth of personality that is truly lifelike. For instance, Jesus is portrayed as a humble man working as a blue-collar worker, a tecton. Yet, his humility does not translate to weakness. Instead, we see moments where Jesus displays intense boldness, even anger in the face of injustice. Such as the time when he wreaks havoc in the temple to cleanse the religious heart of a community that was exploiting its people. He is also portrayed as being extremely likable and sociable. Jesus frequently appears at weddings, dinners, and other social events. In fact, he does this so much that some religious leaders of his time accuse him of being a drunk and a glutton. He was also criticized because he socialized with outsiders like tax collectors, sinners, and prostitutes. And throughout the Gospels, Jesus does show a tremendous amount of concern for those ignored and hated by his peers. He agrees to help a centurion, a soldier of the empire that is subjugating his people and occupying their land. He feeds the poor, heals the sick, and empowers the oppressed. Yet, he also has moments that approach melancholy. There are times in which he retreats from everyone, including his closest friends, to go, be alone on a mountain, and spend quiet moments in prayer and reflection.
In talking to Andrew about what it is that draws him and others to comic books, an interesting theme came up: relatability. And according to Andrew, it's crucial to understanding their appeal.
People like to relate to superheroes. It's something that, you like to put yourself in the shoes of, Spider-Man or Batman. You'd like to try to be that person yourself. So, the closest thing you can do is read the comic and, try to put yourself in that perspective. So I think people like to relate, the best they can to, Peter Parker or Bruce Wayne. So it's the kind of aspect of, relating to this person who's kind of like you, but can have these powers that you can't have. So you kind of like to have someone that you can read about with those powers.
But there's perhaps more to it than just a power fantasy, as Andrew pointed out when we were talking about one of our favorite superheroes, Spider-Man.
What's important about that character is, he has that motto throughout the whole series: is with great power comes great responsibility. He wants to use these powers to, instead of, doing evil, he wants to use them to help people. So I think that's something that really relates to people is, this responsibility you have with these heavy weights on your shoulder. And it's something that I really like about Spider-Man. I think other people like about him too.
We may not know what it's like to fly or have super strength, but we connect to these heroes through relatable experiences. We've all felt pressure, responsibility, and the burden of heavy weights on our shoulders.
Throughout the Gospels, we find many moments in which Jesus is challenged by the burdens of the world, ones that many of us can relate to. For instance, he experiences the loss of loved ones. When he hears of his cousin John's death, he withdraws to a solitary place to mourn. When his close friend Lazarus dies, Jesus weeps and is deeply moved to the point where people say, "Look how he loved him." Later, Jesus is abandoned and neglected by those closest to him as he faces the most pivotal moment of his life. In that same moment, feeling all alone, Jesus feels the weight of the world on his shoulders. He's overcome with overwhelming fear and doubt, to the point where, as one gospel writer puts it, his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. But ultimately, heroically, Jesus gets up, faces his attackers, and moves forward with his mission.
Midtown Comics is a monument to the power of comic books. And that power comes from their heroes. Characters that are larger than life, that perform spectacular feats in impossible scenarios, and yet, at least in the best comics, are also grounded and relatable at the same time. That's how people are able to connect to them, and why they have such passionate fans. The Gospels also present a relatable human character that does seemingly impossible, spectacular things, one that they invite you to connect with. But they do something else that can be really hard to believe. Something that puts them in a completely different genre from most comic books. They present it all as something that actually happened.
But not all of the places detailed in the Gospels were always thought to have actually existed. For instance, in the Gospel of John, there is a story of Jesus healing a man who had been crippled for 38 years at the pool of Bethesda. For years, many would cite this story as an example of why the Gospel narratives could not be authentic. You see, there was no pool of Bethesda. It must have been a fictional place invented by John, who wrote about 50-60 years after Jesus' death. But then, in the late 19th century, archaeologists excavated this place and found a pool, the Pool of Asclepius, which was better known among Jews as the Pool of Bethesda. It's almost impossible to see now, but if we were to remove what's been built on top, we would see a pool with 5 porticos, exactly as described by John in his Gospel.
The Greek word for gospel means good news, and that's how the Gospels are presented, as something that actually happened in actual places, and interestingly, in front of real eyewitnesses.
There are more than 40 people mentioned directly by name in the Gospels, and more than 50 are referenced by their title and/or where they lived. Many of these people were witnesses to miracles of Jesus, and most would have been alive during the time the Gospels were written. The first readers of the Gospels could have and would have been familiar with some of these people, and they would have been able to talk to them about the events described in the Gospels.
The Gospels provide a rich, nuanced depiction of their hero. But unlike the superheroes of a comic book, they present him as real, as someone who actually existed and walked among us.
The Jesus of the Gospels possesses extremely human qualities. He had a blue-collar job. He was likable, relatable, vulnerable at times, and he enjoyed spending time with social outcasts. But they simultaneously present him as someone who performed miraculous acts. For many of us, that's a problematic quality of the Gospel's presentation of Jesus. But almost every historian and scholar would agree Jesus existed. So, what do we do about these difficult, harder to believe elements of the Gospel narrative?
One way to handle that is to do what Thomas Jefferson did. Just cut them out. Thomas Jefferson once described Jesus' teachings as the most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man. But he was also a man of reason and couldn't accept the less empirically provable aspects of the gospel narrative, such as Jesus' miracles and the resurrection. To him, those were simply crude expressions of the gospel writers' misconceptions about Jesus. So Jefferson decided to basically create his own gospel. It's commonly referred to as the Jefferson Bible, but he called it the Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Done for his own personal study, it's a project that took him years to finish. To put it together, he used a razor to cut out portions of all 4 Gospels and place them together in chronological order, compiled in 4 different languages for reference. But if you try the project out yourself, you quickly notice that in order to remove the so-called miraculous elements of the Gospels, Jefferson really had to bend over backwards to include some of these teachings that were so precious to him. You see, in the four Gospels, many of Jesus' teachings and moral lessons are contained within and around a miracle story. So in order to keep his collection of teachings intact, Jefferson would often have to cut off one Gospel writer mid-sentence and finish it with a passage from a different Gospel, one taken from an entirely different context written by a totally different writer. The result is an interesting collection of teachings and a fascinating insight into the mind of one of America's greatest thinkers. But the Jefferson Bible reads similarly to how it was put together, chopped up. The narrative and thematic flow of the Gospels just isn't there, and its picture of Jesus feels incomplete by comparison. Jefferson's Bible, in effect, took the Gospels and made them like many other religious writings, a collection of teachings. Sure, it contains an abbreviated portrait of this man and the beautiful teachings that continue to benefit humanity to this day. But that's just the point. Where else besides the Gospels do we find these teachings of Jesus? And in these Gospels, this portrait of Jesus the man is inexorably tied to their portrait of Jesus as something more.
In the Gospels, there is no denying that Jesus performs acts that are hard for many of us to believe. Yet, interestingly, Jesus' miraculous actions are woven into a believable, credible narrative that is totally unlike anything from its era. The Gospels are filled with stories in which their human, even vulnerable hero moves through actual, existing environments and interacts with real people that have authentic reactions to what's happening. One such example takes place here, in the Sea of Galilee. The scene begins with Jesus deciding to cross the lake with his disciples in their small boat. But as still happens out on the Sea of Galilee, the weather turns. Soon a fierce storm arises. The waves are crashing into their small boat faster than they can get it out, and it begins to fill with water. Throughout this, Jesus is so tired and worn down from the day's work that he is still asleep in the back, resting his head on a cushion. His disciples are understandably panicked. They wake him up and shout, "Don't you care that we are going to drown?" Jesus wakes up, tells the waves to be still, and suddenly the wind stops. There was calm. Then Jesus turns to them with an unusual question. "Why are you afraid?" The disciples are absolutely terrified. They can't believe what they've just seen. As superstitious fishermen, they believe demons and dark spirits dwell beneath the murky waters that this tired man has just somehow commanded into silence. They ask themselves, "Who is this man?" This is the central question behind the Gospels. Every story, every word moves with purpose and intensity towards answering it. Everything we find in the Gospels is there for a reason. The closing words of the final Gospel, the Gospel of John, reference this saying. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written.
The Gospel writers weren't interested in just writing down teachings or a code of ethics. They also weren't interested in simply recording a history of what happened in first century Palestine. Instead, they told a story of a man, a humble, blue-collar, complex, likable, oftentimes astonishing, real man. Because to them, he was so much more than that. He was the key to life itself.